Darlene Doskotil was the kind of girl who could light up a room without even trying. Born in 1974, she grew up in Central Texas, surrounded by family who adored her and classmates who couldn't help but notice her natural charm. With her blonde hair, dazzling smile, and an effortless ability to connect with people, she earned the nickname Texas Beauty Queen. But Darlene wasn't just admired for her looks. She was disciplined, ambitious, and carried herself with the kind of confidence that made everyone believe she was destined for something bigger. Teachers saw her as the radiant leader in school activities. Friends saw her as someone who always made them feel seen. And at home, she was deeply loved, the middle daughter who seemed to balance it all with ease. By the time she graduated from high school in 1993, Darlene already had her path in mind. She enrolled at Texas State Technical College in Waco, setting her sights first on dental work before dreaming bigger: nursing. To those around her, the future looked wide open. She had beauty, brains, and ambition, the kind of girl who, on the surface, seemed unstoppable. But what no one could have imagined back then was how quickly those dreams of a perfect life would twist into something far darker, something that would eventually shatter her family, her reputation, and her freedom. While Darlene radiated energy and ambition, Keith Gentry was her opposite in many ways. Born just 2 months after her in 1974, Keith grew up in Robinson, Texas, a small town where family and loyalty meant everything. He wasn't the type to chase the spotlight. Instead, Keith was steady, dependable, and carried a quiet strength that people naturally respected. At Robinson High School, he didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. Friends described him as reliable, kind-hearted, and grounded. He was the type of young man who didn't seek attention, but when you needed help, he was already there. Keith's path after graduation reflected that same character. He studied drafting and welding at Texas State Technical College, later securing work as an engineering assistant. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. And that was exactly who he was. When Keith and Darlene's paths crossed in college, the chemistry was instant. She was the dazzling beauty queen, full of ambition. He was the quiet provider, strong but understated. Together, they balanced one another perfectly. To their families, it seemed like fate. Both sides embraced the relationship, certain that marriage was only a matter of time. But love doesn't always follow the neat timelines people expect. By 1997, both had graduated, and while Darlene was quietly longing for a proposal, Keith wasn't ready to settle down. He wanted stability first, a solid foundation before taking on marriage and family. Their disagreement led to a painful breakup. For both, it felt like their futures had suddenly collapsed. Darlene moved to Dallas, chasing a fresh start in the city. But the fast-paced urban life didn't suit her. A stolen car, a disconnection from her roots, and a growing sense of emptiness sent her back home within a year, and that's when fate stepped back in. When Darlene and Keith reunited, it was as if the time apart had erased all hesitation. Their love reignited quickly, and this time, there were no doubts. By 1999, Keith proposed. Soon after, they were married, buying their first home and building the life they had once only dreamed about. To outsiders, it looked like a storybook romance finally fulfilled. A radiant beauty queen and a humble provider, starting a family together. But as the years passed, cracks would begin to form in the perfect picture, and those cracks would eventually split wide open. By the early 2000s, Keith and Darlene seemed to have it all. They were young, attractive, and had just purchased a home in Robinson, Texas, right next door to Keith's parents. For a while, their life looked like something out of a family magazine. Keith worked as an engineering assistant at a local utility company, while Darlene pursued her nursing degree and eventually landed a job as a registered nurse. With 2 stable incomes, they enjoyed a comfortable lifestyle, not extravagant, but secure enough to raise a family and indulge in small luxuries. In 2001, they welcomed their first son, Chase. Cody followed in 2004, and by 2005, their third child, Cade, completed the family. 3 boys, 2 devoted parents, and the constant support of nearby grandparents. Neighbors saw them as a picture-perfect family, a well-kept home, loving parents, and children who seemed to embody the happiness of their household. But what people didn't see was the strain beneath the surface. Keith's job, though steady, often required travel, leaving Darlene to juggle the children, the house, and her work on her own. Even when he was home, Keith was exhausted, often too drained to step into the chaos of parenting 3 young boys. Seeing how much pressure it placed on Darlene, Keith made what he thought was the selfless choice. He left his better-paying, travel-heavy job for a lower-paying desk position that kept him closer to home. It was a sacrifice born out of love. But it also came with consequences. The pay cut strained their finances, and Keith began to feel stuck in a role he didn't enjoy. Meanwhile, Darlene's spending habits didn't seem to change. She maintained a beautiful home, hosted gatherings, and bought things they couldn't always afford. Money became a constant source of friction. The couple who once laughed easily now argued more often. Their relationship, once fueled by passion and devotion, began to feel weighed down by resentment and stress. Friends noticed the tension. Relatives whispered that something wasn't quite right. Still, divorce was never openly discussed. Keith, especially, seemed determined to keep his family together, no matter the cost. To the outside world, they remained the golden couple. But inside their home, pressure was quietly building. Pressure that was about to erupt in the most devastating way imaginable. November 9th, 2005, started like any other morning in the Doskasil household, or at least, that's what it looked like from the outside. Keith got ready for work at the utility office, grabbing his coffee and heading out the door while the kids still slept. Darlene stayed behind, preparing to manage the day with 3 boys under the age of 5. But by mid-morning, the picture-perfect routine had shattered. Keith's co-workers noticed something strange. He hadn't shown up for work, and no one had heard from him. It wasn't like Keith to miss a shift without calling. He was dependable, almost to a fault. Concern began to spread. Hours later, Keith's body was discovered inside the family's home. He had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the head. The scene was horrifying, and yet unsettlingly calm. Nothing in the house appeared to have been stolen. There was no sign of a break-in. The couple's 3 children, all under the age of 5, had been home at the time of the shooting, but somehow they were unharmed. When investigators arrived, their first question circled around the obvious. Who could want Keith dead? Was it a burglary gone wrong or something closer to home? And almost immediately, one name rose to the top of the suspect list, Darlene. On the surface, it seemed unthinkable. The young mother who had dedicated her life to nursing, who smiled in every family photo, who neighbors described as sweet and devoted, how could she be involved? But investigators quickly learned that the reality of Darlene's life was far darker than the image she projected. Behind the walls of that tidy suburban home, secrets were piling up. Secrets that would soon paint Darlene not as the grieving widow, but as the mastermind behind her husband's death. Detectives didn't waste any time. From the very first walkthrough of the Doskasil home, something felt wrong. There was no forced entry, no missing valuables, no ransacked rooms. Whoever had killed Keith hadn't come from the outside. They had been invited in. Naturally, investigators turned to Darlene. She played the part of the devastated widow, telling police she had no idea what could have happened. But as hours turned into days, cracks in her story began to show. Neighbors whispered that Darlene hadn't exactly been the picture of a grieving wife. Some said she seemed detached, almost cold, in the days after Keith's death. Others recalled that the couple had been arguing more frequently, often about money. And then there were the rumors. Whispers of Darlene being seen out with another man while Keith was away for work. Police pressed harder, and what they uncovered shocked even seasoned investigators. Darlene had been living a double life, On one side, she was the devoted mother and nurse. On the other, she was reckless with money, deep in debt, and entangled in secret relationships. The financial strain on the Doskasil household was not just a little tight. They were drowning. Credit cards maxed out, bills piling up, Darlene spending beyond their means while Keith tried to hold it all together. When detectives confronted her with the evidence, Darlene's story began to crumble. First, she denied everything. Then she shifted blame, suggesting maybe Keith had enemies they didn't know about. But under relentless questioning, her mask slipped. Eventually, she admitted to knowing more than she had first revealed. Darlene confessed that she had been involved in planning Keith's death. She hadn't pulled the trigger herself, but she had orchestrated it. The person who ended Keith's life wasn't a stranger. It was someone Darlene had brought into their home. The revelations stunned everyone who knew them. To the outside world, Darlene had been the perfect wife and mother. But behind closed doors, she had been plotting the unthinkable. The murder of her husband, the father of her children, the man who had given up his own happiness to keep their family together. And the question everyone now wanted answered was simple. Why? When the truth finally surfaced, it was worse than anyone expected. Investigators pieced together Darlene's hidden life, and the picture was chilling. Beneath the polished surface of a nurse and mother, Darlene was suffocating in debt, entangled in affairs, and craving a lifestyle that Keith could no longer provide. The motive boiled down to two things: money and freedom. Keith had recently taken out a life insurance policy, one that Darlene would benefit from if anything happened to him. To detectives, that was the first red flag. But it wasn't just about the money. Darlene had grown resentful of Keith's sacrifices, the lower-paying job, the constant financial stress, the life she thought was holding her back. She saw Keith not as her partner, but as her obstacle. Prosecutors argued that Darlene wanted to escape her responsibilities. With Keith gone, she would collect the insurance payout and be free to live the life she thought she deserved. To her, it was the perfect solution. To everyone else, it was unthinkable. The trial that followed was nothing short of sensational. The small Texas town was rocked as headlines screamed about the Texas beauty queen turned Black Widow. The courtroom was packed with reporters, neighbors, and even strangers who wanted to see the woman behind the scandal. Witnesses testified about her reckless spending habits and mounting debts. Others revealed the affairs she had tried so hard to hide. The most damning evidence, however, was her own confession and the testimony of the man she had conspired with to carry out the murder. The jury didn't take long to reach a decision. They found Darlene guilty of capital murder. In 2006, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At just 32 years old, the former beauty queen who once seemed to have it all was now behind bars, stripped of her freedom and her family. The verdict brought justice for Keith, but it also left 3 young boys without either parent. Their father was gone, and their mother would never come home again. It was a sobering reminder that behind the facade of perfection, unimaginable darkness can be hiding, waiting for the moment to strike. When the truth finally surfaced, it was worse than anyone expected. Investigators pieced together Darlene's hidden life, and the picture was chilling. Beneath the polished surface of a nurse and mother, Darlene was suffocating in debt, entangled in affairs, and craving a lifestyle that Keith could no longer provide. The motive boiled down to two things: money and freedom. Keith had recently taken out a life insurance policy, one that Darlene would benefit from if anything happened to him. To detectives, that was the first red flag. But it wasn't just about the money. Darlene had grown resentful of Keith's sacrifices, the lower-paying job, the constant financial stress, the life she thought was holding her back. She saw Keith not as her partner, but as her obstacle. Prosecutors argued that Darlene wanted to escape her responsibilities. With Keith gone, she would collect the insurance payout and be free to live the life she thought she deserved. To her, it was the perfect solution. To everyone else, it was unthinkable. The trial that followed was nothing short of sensational. The small Texas town was rocked as headlines screamed about the Texas beauty queen turned Black Widow. The courtroom was packed with reporters, neighbors, and even strangers who wanted to see the woman behind the scandal. Witnesses testified about her reckless spending habits and mounting debts. Others revealed the affairs she had tried so hard to hide. The most damning evidence, however, was her own confession and the testimony of the man she had conspired with to carry out the murder. The jury didn't take long to reach a decision. They found Darlene guilty of capital murder. In 2006, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At just 32 years old, the former beauty queen who once seemed to have it all was now behind bars, stripped of her freedom and her family. The verdict brought justice for Keith, but it also left 3 young boys without either parent. Their father was gone, and their mother would never come home again. It was a sobering reminder that behind the facade of perfection, unimaginable darkness can be hiding, waiting for the moment to strike. When the gavel struck and Darlene was sentenced to life in prison, the story didn't simply end. In many ways, it was just beginning. For her children, her family, and the small Texas community that had once admired her. Keith's parents, who had lived next door, suddenly found themselves raising 3 boys who had lost both their mother and their father in the same moment. The children grew up knowing their father had been taken from them, and that their mother was the one responsible. That shadow is something no child can ever fully escape. For the public, the story became a cautionary tale. Newspapers branded Darlene as a Black Widow nurse, a nickname that stuck and amplified the shock of her betrayal. To many, she embodied the darkest kind of deception, the smiling wife who harbored lethal secrets. Even behind bars, Darlene remained a subject of fascination. Some saw her as cold and calculating, a woman willing to destroy her own family for money and personal freedom. Others argued she had been overwhelmed, unable to cope with the pressures of motherhood, debt, and unmet expectations. Whatever the interpretation, one thing was certain. Her story stirred emotions because it touched on a universal fear. The idea that the people we trust most can sometimes be the ones to hurt us the worst. Over the years, true crime shows and documentaries revisited her case. Each retelling sparked the same reaction: disbelief that a woman who seemed to have everything could throw it all away in such a brutal, irreversible act. Today, nearly 2 decades later, the Doscocil case is still remembered not just as a local tragedy, but as a haunting reminder that appearances can be dangerously deceiving. Darlene S., fall from admired beauty queen to convicted murderer, continues to shock anyone who stumbles across her story. And while Darlene will likely spend the rest of her life behind prison walls, the real legacy belongs to Keith and the 3 boys he left behind. They are the ones who carry the scars of November 9th, 2005, the day the mask slipped and the truth about Darlene finally came out. When people first met Darlene Doscocil, they saw the smile, the charm, the ambition. She seemed destined for a life filled with promise. But behind that polished image was a storm of resentment, debt, and deception that eventually consumed everything she touched. Keith gave up his own happiness to keep his family afloat. He worked jobs he didn't love, sacrificed his dreams, and tried to be the anchor his wife needed. In the end, those sacrifices cost him his life. Darlene's story forces us to confront an unsettling truth. Evil doesn't always wear a mask we can recognize. Sometimes it looks like the friend next door, the coworker at the office, or even the partner we share our life with. Nearly 20 years later, her case still lingers because it raises the kind of questions that never really have answers. How could someone trade love for greed? How could a mother choose money over her children's future? And how well do we really know the people we let into our lives? Darlene may never leave prison walls, but her choices left scars that will never fade. Not for her children, not for Keith's family, and not for the community that once admired her. It's a story that reminds us that appearances deceive, and sometimes the darkest truths hide behind the brightest smiles.